Chapter 1: The Dawn of the Renaissance, Florence and the Medici. In the early 1300s, much of Europe remained shrouded in what later historians would somewhat unfairly call the Dark Ages, a long period following the fall of Rome, where classical learning had faded quietly into monastery libraries and half-forgotten manuscripts. Yet, in the northern Italian city of Florence, something quiet and remarkable was beginning to stir. Florence sat at the crossroads of trade routes, stretching between northern Europe and the Mediterranean, and its merchant families had grown extraordinarily wealthy through banking, textiles, and careful, patient commerce. Among these families, one name would eventually rise above all others: the Medici. The Medici family built their fortune through banking, extending credit across Europe with a level of financial sophistication unmatched by most rulers of the time. Rather than hoarding this wealth quietly, they began spending it in a way that would reshape the entire cultural landscape of their city. Cosimo de' Medici, patriarch of the family's rising influence, believed strongly that art, architecture, and scholarship reflected the true glory of a city, not merely its military strength or political power. He began funding artists, architects, and scholars generously, asking in return only that Florence itself become more beautiful, more learned, more remarkable. This patronage created something unprecedented, a city where talented craftsmen no longer depended solely on church commissions, but could instead pursue ambitious, experimental work, funded by wealthy families competing quietly with one another for prestige and legacy. Florentine workshops began filling with young apprentices learning techniques that pushed far beyond the flat, symbolic religious art that had dominated Europe for centuries. Perspective, anatomy, and naturalistic detail became subjects of serious, systematic study rather than simple inherited tradition. One young sculptor, working diligently within this environment, would eventually produce works so lifelike that viewers reported feeling as though the marble itself might begin breathing. His name, along with several other remarkable talents emerging from Florentine workshops during these decades, would eventually become inseparable from the very idea of the Renaissance itself. Architecture transformed alongside sculpture and painting. A young architect named Filippo Brunelleschi, obsessed with the mathematical proportions of ancient Roman buildings, spent years studying surviving ruins before returning to Florence with revolutionary ideas about domes, arches, and structural engineering. His greatest challenge arrived when Florence's Grand Cathedral needed a dome unlike anything successfully built since ancient Rome, an engineering problem so difficult that many considered it simply impossible. Brunelleschi's innovative double-shell design, completed after years of painstaking construction, would stand as one of the era's most remarkable architectural achievements. Beyond individual buildings and sculptures, something deeper was shifting throughout Florentine intellectual life. Scholars began rediscovering ancient Greek and Roman texts, many preserved for centuries in monasteries, or brought back through renewed contact with Byzantine scholars fleeing the declining Byzantine Empire. This rediscovery sparked a movement historians would later call humanism, a renewed focus on human potential, individual achievement, and classical learning, standing in gentle contrast to the purely religious focus that had dominated intellectual life for so many previous centuries. Wealthy families began collecting ancient manuscripts with the same enthusiasm they once reserved for gold and jewels, funding translations and copies that spread classical knowledge more widely than it had traveled in nearly 1,000 years. Florence, quietly and without any single dramatic turning point, had become something genuinely new, a city where art, architecture, scholarship, and commerce reinforced one another in ways that would soon draw talented individuals from across Italy, all eager to participate in whatever remarkable transformation was clearly taking shape within its walls. Chapter 2: Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Among the many talented individuals drawn toward Florence's remarkable cultural energy, few would eventually become as broadly, endlessly curious as a young apprentice born in the small town of Vinci in 1452. His name, quite simply, was Leonardo, and his curiosity would eventually stretch across painting, engineering, anatomy, botany, and dozens of other fields most people of his era never thought to combine within a single restless mind. Leonardo trained initially in the workshop of a respected Florentine painter, learning traditional techniques before quickly beginning to push far beyond them. He filled notebook after notebook with observations, sketches, and questions, ranging from the mechanics of flight to the precise movement of water, from human anatomy to the design of impossible, imaginative machines centuries ahead of available technology. His paintings, though relatively few in number compared to many contemporaries, achieved a level of subtlety and naturalism that seemed to breathe genuine life into painted surfaces. Soft transitions of light and shadow, a technique later called sfumato, gave his figures a depth and presence that felt startlingly different from the flatter religious imagery of previous centuries. Leonardo's restless curiosity meant he rarely finished projects quickly, often abandoning commissions entirely when his attention shifted towards some new fascinating question. Patrons found him brilliant but frustrating, a pattern that would follow him throughout a career spent moving between Florence, Milan, and eventually France, always chasing whatever question currently occupied his extraordinary mind. Meanwhile, a different kind of genius was emerging just slightly later, born in 1475 in a small town near Florence. Michelangelo Buonarroti showed such obvious talent as a young apprentice that he was soon working under the patronage of the Medici family themselves, studying ancient sculpture and developing a mastery of the human form that would eventually rival, and some argued surpass, even classical Roman artistry. Michelangelo approached marble differently than most sculptors of his time, famously describing his process as simply freeing the figure already existing within the stone, rather than imposing an external design upon unwilling material. This philosophy produced sculptures of remarkable emotional depth, muscles and expressions carved with anatomical precision that suggested years of careful, dedicated study. His statue of David, carved from a massive block of marble other sculptors had previously deemed too flawed to use, became an instant sensation upon completion. Installed prominently in Florence, as a powerful symbol of the city's own resilience and civic pride. Yet Michelangelo's talents extended far beyond sculpture alone. When summoned to Rome to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, he initially resisted, considering himself primarily a sculptor rather than a painter. Working largely alone over several exhausting years, often lying on his back atop scaffolding for hours at a time, he eventually produced one of the most ambitious painted ceilings in human history. The relationship between Leonardo and Michelangelo, two towering talents working in overlapping circles during overlapping decades, was famously cool rather than warm, marked by mutual respect tangled with genuine personal rivalry. Contemporary accounts describe tension whenever the two found themselves in the same Florentine spaces, each keenly aware of the other's extraordinary reputation. Their combined influence, alongside numerous other remarkable talents working throughout Italy during these decades, elevated what people expected from art entirely. Painting and sculpture were no longer simply decorative or purely religious in function, but increasingly understood as vehicles for genuine intellectual and emotional depth, worthy of the same serious study once reserved exclusively for philosophy and literature. Workshops throughout Italy began training new generations of artists, specifically hoping to capture even a fraction of what Leonardo and Michelangelo had achieved, spreading techniques of perspective, anatomy, and naturalistic detail far beyond Florence itself, into cities eager to claim their own share of this remarkable cultural transformation. By the time both men reached the later years of their extraordinary careers, the Renaissance itself had grown from a distinctly Florentine phenomenon into something spreading rapidly across Italy and, increasingly, toward the rest of Europe, carried forward by students, imitators, and patrons, all eager to participate in whatever remarkable transformation these towering figures had helped set irreversibly into motion. Chapter 3. The Printing Press and the Spread of Knowledge. While Florence filled with remarkable paintings and sculptures, a quieter but arguably more transformative revolution was unfolding several hundred miles north, in the German city of Mainz. There, around 1440, a goldsmith and craftsman named Johannes Gutenberg had been experimenting for years with a problem that had frustrated scholars for centuries: how to reproduce written text faster than a single scribe copying by hand. Books before this period existed as painstaking, singular treasures, each one copied by hand over weeks or months by monks or professional scribes, making even a modest personal library an extraordinary luxury available only to the wealthiest institutions and individuals. Gutenberg's innovation combined several existing technologies into something genuinely new: individual, reusable metal letters that could be arranged into any combination of words, inked evenly, and pressed repeatedly onto paper using a modified wine press mechanism. This movable type system meant a single page, once arranged, could be reproduced hundreds of times far faster than any scribe could manage even a single handwritten copy. His most famous production, a beautifully printed Bible completed around 1455, demonstrated the technology's remarkable potential, matching the visual quality scribes had achieved while requiring only a fraction of the time and, eventually, cost. News of this printing technology spread with startling speed across Europe, workshops adopting and refining Gutenberg's methods within just a few decades. By the early 1500s, printing presses operated in cities throughout Italy, Germany, France, and beyond, each one capable of producing books at a scale simply unimaginable only a generation earlier. This explosion in book production had consequences far beyond simple convenience. Classical texts rediscovered by Florentine humanists could now be reproduced and distributed widely, rather than remaining locked within a handful of wealthy private collections. Scholars across different cities and even different countries could finally read, discuss, and build upon the same shared texts. Literacy itself began expanding gradually beyond the clergy and wealthy nobility who had previously monopolized reading and writing. Merchants, craftsmen, and eventually even some working-class individuals found practical reasons to learn reading, as printed materials covering trade, science, and everyday practical knowledge became increasingly available and affordable. The printing press also transformed how new ideas spread and how quickly they could be challenged or debated. A scholar publishing new observations or arguments in one city might see responses, criticisms, or expansions arrive from colleagues in entirely different countries within just months, rather than the years such intellectual exchange had previously required through slow, handwritten correspondence. This accelerated exchange of ideas would eventually prove enormously significant beyond purely artistic or scholarly circles. Religious reformers, scientific innovators, and political theorists throughout the following century would all rely heavily on printing technology to spread their arguments far faster and more widely than earlier reform movements had ever managed. Maps, too, benefited enormously from printing technology, allowing increasingly accurate geographic knowledge to spread quickly among sailors, merchants, and explorers, just as Europe's age of exploration began accelerating toward distant, previously unknown shores. By the early 1500s, printing houses had become significant businesses in their own right, employing skilled craftsmen who specialized in typesetting, illustration, and binding, creating an entirely new industry that itself contributed meaningfully to the economic vitality, driving the broader Renaissance forward. Some historians would later argue that Gutenberg's printing press, more than any single painting or sculpture, represented the true turning point, separating the medieval world from everything that followed, a quiet mechanical innovation that fundamentally changed how human knowledge itself could travel, multiply, and endure across generations. Chapter 4: The Northern Renaissance. While Italy's Renaissance drew heavily upon rediscovered classical antiquity, a distinctly different artistic transformation was unfolding simultaneously across the Netherlands, Germany, and other regions north of the Alps, one shaped less by ancient Rome and more by meticulous, almost obsessive attention to observed reality. In the wealthy trading cities of Flanders, particularly Bruges and Ghent, a painter named Jan van Eyck was perfecting techniques with oil paint that allowed for extraordinarily fine detail and luminous layered color. Where Italian painters often emphasized grand composition and idealized human form, Van Eyck focused intensely on texture, light, and the precise rendering of everyday objects. His famous double portrait of a merchant couple, painted around 1434, demonstrated this obsessive realism vividly, capturing fabric textures, a small dog's individual hairs, and a convex mirror reflecting the entire room, with startling, almost photographic precision, centuries before photography itself would exist. This northern approach to painting valued patient, almost scientific observation, artists spending considerable time studying exactly how light fell across different surfaces, how fabric folded and creased, and how individual faces revealed personality through small, carefully observed details, rather than idealized classical proportion. Merchant wealth in northern trading cities, similar to Florence's banking fortunes, funded much of this artistic flourishing. Wealthy Flemish and Dutch merchants commissioned portraits, religious scenes, and increasingly, detailed depictions of everyday domestic life, creating demand for artists skilled in this precise observational style. In Germany, meanwhile, an artist named Albrecht Dürer was combining northern attention to detail with growing awareness of Italian artistic theory, having traveled south specifically to study proportion, perspective, and classical technique directly from Italian masters and their surviving influence. Dürer became particularly renowned for his printmaking, using woodcuts and engravings to create detailed, widely reproducible images that, thanks to the printing press's growing availability, could spread his artistic influence far more widely than paintings alone ever could have managed. His famous self-portraits, remarkably confident and technically sophisticated for their era, demonstrated a growing sense among northern artists that they, too, deserved recognition as serious intellectual figures, not merely skilled craftsmen serving wealthy patrons' decorative preferences. Religious themes remained more persistently central to Northern Renaissance art than they often did in Italy, reflecting the region's particular religious intensity during this period, a period that would soon see dramatic religious upheaval as reformist ideas began spreading rapidly throughout German-speaking territories. Northern Renaissance artists also pioneered detailed landscape painting as its own serious subject, moving gradually away from landscapes serving merely as backgrounds for religious or portrait subjects, toward careful, atmospheric depictions of nature itself as worthy of serious artistic attention. Trade and cultural exchange between Italy and Northern Europe meant these two distinct Renaissance traditions increasingly influenced one another as the era progressed, Italian artists occasionally adopting Northern techniques for oil paint and fine detail, while Northern artists gradually incorporated more Italian-influenced classical proportion and idealized composition. By the early 1500s, this blending of Northern precision and Italian classical influence had created a rich, varied artistic landscape across Europe, one where regional traditions maintained distinct characteristics while increasingly drawing upon shared techniques, shared classical knowledge, and an increasingly interconnected community of artists, patrons, and scholars stretching from Florence to Antwerp and every major city between them. Chapter 5. Venice and the Power of Trade. While Florence built its reputation through banking, and Rome through papal patronage, another Italian city was quietly becoming one of the wealthiest and most powerful centers of the entire Renaissance world, built almost entirely upon the sea itself. Venice, constructed across a lagoon of small islands, had spent centuries developing into Europe's dominant maritime trading power. Venetian ships controlled crucial trade routes, connecting Europe with the Byzantine Empire, the Middle East, and beyond, bringing spices, silk, and countless other valuable goods into European markets, while Venetian merchants grew extraordinarily wealthy, managing this constant flow of commerce. This maritime wealth funded a distinctly Venetian artistic tradition, one that, much like the Northern Renaissance, showed particular fascination with color, light, and the shimmering, reflective quality of the city's watery surroundings. Venetian painters became renowned specifically for their masterful, luminous use of color. A painter named Titian, working through much of the 1500s, became perhaps the era's most celebrated Venetian artist, developing techniques for building rich, layered color that seemed to glow from within his canvases, influencing generations of painters who followed his innovative approach to color and light. Venice's political structure also differed meaningfully from other major Italian cities. Rather than a single ruling family like Florence's Medici, Venice operated as a republic governed by an elected council of wealthy merchants, creating a somewhat more distributed form of patronage that funded public buildings, churches, and civic art projects throughout the city. The city's unique relationship with water shaped its architecture distinctively as well, Buildings designed with canal-facing facades, meant to be viewed primarily from boats gliding along the water, creating an urban landscape unlike anywhere else in Renaissance Italy. Venice's continued trade connections with the Byzantine world also meant the city maintained particularly strong access to preserved Greek manuscripts and scholarly traditions, contributing significantly to the broader humanist rediscovery of classical knowledge spreading throughout Renaissance Italy. Printing flourished remarkably in Venice as well, the city becoming one of Europe's most significant printing centers by the early 1500s, producing an enormous volume of books covering everything from classical literature to contemporary scientific observation, further cementing the city's role as a crucial hub connecting different strands of Renaissance intellectual life. Venetian glassmaking, particularly from the island of Murano, achieved similarly remarkable sophistication during this period, artisans developing techniques for extraordinarily fine, colorful glasswork that became prized luxury items traded throughout Europe alongside the city's other significant exports. Despite this remarkable wealth and cultural achievement, Venice's dominant maritime trading position gradually faced growing challenges as the era progressed, particularly as Portuguese and Spanish explorers began establishing new sea routes to Asia that bypassed the Mediterranean trade networks Venice had relied upon for centuries. Even as this economic pressure gradually mounted, Venice's cultural and artistic legacy from this period remained enormously influential, its distinctive approach to color, light, and civic architecture continuing to shape European artistic tradition long after the city's peak commercial dominance had eventually begun its own gradual, complicated decline. Chapter 6: Rome and the Power of the Popes. While Florence had ignited the earliest sparks of Renaissance culture, Rome would eventually become the era's most extravagant stage, transformed by a series of ambitious popes determined to restore the city's ancient imperial grandeur through art, architecture, and monumental building projects unlike anything attempted in centuries. Pope Julius II, elected in 1503, proved particularly determined in this ambition. Deeply invested in restoring Rome's former glory, he began commissioning projects on a scale that would define the High Renaissance's most spectacular achievements, pulling talented artists from across Italy directly into papal service. It was Julius who summoned Michelangelo to Rome, initially for a grand papal tomb project, before redirecting his talents toward the Sistine Chapel ceiling, a decision that would eventually produce one of history's most celebrated painted works, despite Michelangelo's own persistent preference for sculpture over painting. Simultaneously, Julius commissioned a young painter named Raphael to decorate a series of papal apartments, rooms that would eventually showcase Raphael's remarkable gift for harmonious composition, balanced color, and graceful, idealized human figures that many considered the era's most perfect artistic embodiment of classical Renaissance ideals. Raphael's School of Athens, painted within these papal apartments, depicted an imagined gathering of ancient philosophers, some scholars believing Raphael modeled certain figures after contemporary artists and thinkers he personally admired, blending classical subject matter with distinctly Renaissance intellectual reverence for ancient wisdom. Beyond painting, Julius also initiated perhaps the era's most ambitious architectural project, a complete rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, the central church of Western Christianity, employing a succession of Renaissance architects, including eventually Michelangelo himself, who contributed significantly to the building's massive dome design. This concentration of extraordinary talent within Rome created intense competition and occasional friction between artists, each keenly aware that papal favor could mean either extraordinary opportunity or, if displeased, the sudden loss of prestigious commissions entirely. Papal wealth funding these massive projects came partly through controversial means, including the sale of indulgences, payments believed to reduce time spent in purgatory, a practice that would soon become one of the central grievances driving religious reformers toward open rebellion against the Catholic Church's authority. Rome's transformation during this period extended beyond individual buildings and artworks into broader urban planning. Streets widened, ancient ruins studied and sometimes incorporated into new construction, and the city gradually reshaped into something intended to rival, or even surpass, the grandeur of ancient imperial Rome, that had once ruled from these same 7 hills. Wealthy cardinals throughout Rome competed similarly with the papacy itself in funding lavish palaces, chapels, and art collections, creating additional patronage opportunities that drew even more talented artists, architects, and craftsmen into the city's rapidly expanding cultural orbit. By the 1520s, Rome had firmly established itself as the Renaissance's most spectacular artistic center, its churches, palaces, and public spaces filled with masterworks that continue drawing visitors centuries later, even as the religious and political tensions quietly building throughout this same period would soon erupt into transformations every bit as significant as anything the Renaissance itself had produced. Chapter 7: The Awakening of Science. Alongside the remarkable flourishing of art and architecture, the Renaissance's renewed fascination with careful observation and classical knowledge gradually extended into questions about the natural world itself, planting seeds that would eventually grow into an entirely new approach to understanding the universe. For centuries, European scholars had accepted an Earth-centered model of the cosmos, one largely inherited from ancient Greek astronomy and reinforced by medieval theological interpretation. This model held that the sun, moon, and all visible planets orbited around a stationary Earth, positioned firmly at the center of creation. A Polish astronomer named Nicolaus Copernicus, working quietly through much of the early 1500s, began questioning this long-accepted model after years of careful mathematical calculation and astronomical observation. His calculations suggested something radical. Perhaps the Earth itself moved, orbiting around the sun rather than remaining fixed at the universe's center. Copernicus understood the potentially controversial nature of this idea, delaying publication of his complete theory for decades, reportedly fearing both scholarly ridicule and potential religious controversy. His major work, finally published in 1543, the same year of his death, presented this heliocentric model with careful mathematical support. Initial reaction remained relatively muted, Copernicus's work reaching primarily specialized astronomical circles rather than triggering immediate widespread controversy. Yet the theory planted an important intellectual seed, suggesting that direct observation and mathematical calculation might sometimes reveal truths that contradicted centuries of accepted tradition. This growing willingness to question inherited assumptions through careful observation extended into other fields as well. Physicians began conducting more detailed anatomical study, sometimes controversially through direct human dissection, developing increasingly accurate understanding of human bodily structure that corrected numerous long-held misconceptions. Andreas Vesalius, a physician working in this same general period, published detailed anatomical illustrations based on his own careful dissections, correcting errors that had persisted since ancient Greek physician Galen's original, less precisely observed anatomical descriptions centuries earlier. The printing press, once again, played a crucial role in this scientific awakening, allowing detailed illustrations, careful mathematical calculations, and challenging new theories to spread quickly among scholars across different cities and countries, enabling exactly the kind of collaborative, cumulative scientific progress that isolated, slower-moving handwritten scholarship had rarely achieved. This growing scientific curiosity remained, during this particular period, still closely intertwined with broader Renaissance humanism, scholars often viewing careful observation of nature as simply another way of appreciating the same divine order and rational structure they found equally compelling in classical philosophy and mathematics. Universities throughout Europe gradually began incorporating this more observation-based approach into their curricula, though considerable resistance persisted among scholars firmly committed to traditional, purely text-based approaches inherited from medieval scholastic tradition. These early developments in astronomy and anatomy represented only the initial stirrings of what would eventually become a much broader scientific transformation, one that later generations would need several more decades and several more remarkable individual thinkers to fully develop into the systematic scientific method later centuries would come to recognize and celebrate. Yet even in these earlier, more tentative stages, something significant had already shifted. The Renaissance's core assumption, that careful human observation and reason could meaningfully advance understanding beyond what ancient authorities alone had established, had begun extending firmly beyond art and literature into humanity's understanding of the physical universe itself. Chapter 8. The Reformation's Intersection with the Renaissance. The same intellectual currents fueling Renaissance art, scholarship, and scientific curiosity also contributed, somewhat unexpectedly, to one of the most significant religious upheavals in European history, a transformation that would soon reshape the continent's political and spiritual landscape almost as dramatically as anything happening within Florentine workshops or Roman papal apartments. Humanist scholars, in their enthusiasm for returning directly to original classical and religious texts, rather than relying solely on centuries of accumulated theological interpretation, had inadvertently created intellectual tools that religious reformers would soon use to challenge the Catholic Church's established authority. A German monk and university professor named Martin Luther, troubled increasingly by what he viewed as corrupt practices within the Church, particularly the sale of indulgences funding projects like Rome's massive building campaigns, published a list of formal grievances in 1517, famously nailing them, according to popular tradition, to a church door in Wittenberg. Luther's arguments drew directly upon careful, humanist-influenced study of biblical text, arguing that salvation came through faith alone rather than through purchased indulgences or church-mediated ritual, a position that directly challenged papal authority and the Church's established religious and financial structures. The printing press, that same revolutionary technology enabling Renaissance scholarship's rapid spread, proved equally crucial in disseminating Luther's arguments far more widely and quickly than church authorities could effectively suppress, his writings reaching readers across German-speaking territories within remarkably short periods of time. What began as an internal theological dispute rapidly escalated into a broader religious and political movement. Various German territories, and eventually other European regions, choosing to break entirely from Catholic authority, establishing new Protestant religious traditions that would permanently fracture Western Christianity's previous unity. This religious upheaval created complicated tensions with ongoing Renaissance artistic and cultural patronage. Protestant regions often grew increasingly suspicious of elaborate religious art and lavish church decoration, viewing such extravagance as symptomatic of exactly the corruption reformers sought to eliminate. Some Northern Renaissance artists found their traditional religious commissions dwindling significantly in newly Protestant territories, prompting a gradual shift toward portraiture, landscape, and secular subject matter as artists adapted to changing patronage patterns shaped by this ongoing religious transformation. Catholic regions, meanwhile, often doubled down on elaborate religious art, specifically as a tool for reinforcing traditional faith, eventually contributing to what later art historians would identify as a distinct counter-Reformation artistic style, emphasizing dramatic, emotionally persuasive religious imagery designed to reinforce Catholic devotion. This religious fracturing also intersected complicatedly with the era's growing scientific curiosity, as questions about biblical interpretation, church authority, and the proper relationship between faith and direct observation all became increasingly entangled during this turbulent period of transformation. Political rulers throughout Europe found themselves navigating increasingly complex religious loyalties, some embracing Protestant reform for genuine theological conviction, others recognizing practical political advantages in breaking free from papal authority and its associated financial and political obligations. By the mid-1500s, Europe's religious and cultural landscape had transformed dramatically from where it had stood merely a century earlier. The same intellectual energy that had produced Florence's remarkable artistic flourishing, having also, through unexpected and complicated pathways, contributed significantly to permanently reshaping Western Christianity's religious unity. Chapter 9. Humanism and the Renaissance Mind. Beneath the visible achievements of painting, sculpture, and architecture, a quieter but equally significant transformation was unfolding within how educated Europeans understood human nature itself, its purpose, and its place within the broader order of creation. Medieval intellectual life had generally emphasized human limitation and dependence upon divine grace, viewing earthly existence primarily as preparation for the afterlife rather than something valuable in its own immediate right. Renaissance humanism gradually introduced a meaningfully different emphasis, one celebrating human potential, individual achievement, and the dignity of earthly accomplishment. An Italian scholar named Pico della Mirandola captured this shifting sentiment vividly in a famous oration written around 1486, arguing that human beings occupied a unique, remarkable position within creation, possessing the freedom to shape their own nature through choice and effort rather than remaining fixed within a predetermined, unchanging role. This humanist emphasis on individual potential and achievement helped explain much of the era's fascination with what contemporaries began calling the ideal of the well-rounded individual, a person cultivating excellence across multiple fields simultaneously, much as Leonardo da Vinci had famously done across painting, engineering, and scientific observation. Educational reformers throughout Italy began advocating for curricula emphasizing classical literature, rhetoric, history, and moral philosophy alongside traditional religious instruction, believing this broader education better prepared individuals for meaningful civic and personal life, rather than narrow specialized training alone. Wealthy families increasingly sought this humanist education for their children, hiring tutors specifically trained in classical languages and literature, creating growing demand for scholars capable of teaching Greek and Latin texts with genuine depth and understanding, rather than superficial memorization alone. This educational shift gradually extended beyond Italy, humanist scholars traveling throughout Europe establishing schools and academies that spread these same educational values into France, England, and other regions, increasingly influenced by Italian Renaissance intellectual currents. A Dutch scholar named Erasmus became one of this broader humanist movement's most influential figures. His extensive writings and careful new translations of classical and religious texts reaching readers across Europe through the same printing technology accelerating so many other Renaissance developments. Erasmus advocated for careful, scholarly engagement with original texts rather than accepting inherited interpretation uncritically, an approach that influenced both religious reformers like Luther and more traditional Catholic scholars, despite Erasmus himself ultimately remaining committed to reforming the Church from within rather than breaking from it entirely. This humanist intellectual current also shaped growing Renaissance interest in political philosophy, scholars increasingly examining questions of governance, civic virtue, and effective leadership through careful study of classical Roman and Greek political thought, alongside observation of contemporary Italian city-state politics. Niccolò Machiavelli, a Florentine political thinker and diplomat, produced perhaps this period's most famous and most controversial political treatise, offering unusually candid, pragmatic observations about how rulers actually maintained and exercised power, rather than idealized theoretical descriptions of how governance should ideally function. By the mid-1500s, this humanist intellectual current had fundamentally reshaped how educated Europeans understood human potential, education, and civic life, creating an intellectual foundation that would continue influencing European thought for centuries beyond the Renaissance's own eventual, gradual conclusion. Chapter 10: The Age of Exploration. As Renaissance ideas about careful observation, mathematical calculation, and confident human capability spread throughout Europe, these same intellectual currents helped fuel an entirely different kind of ambitious undertaking, one that would eventually connect Europe with lands and peoples entirely unknown to previous generations of European scholars and merchants. Portugal had begun this exploratory push earlier than most, Portuguese sailors gradually working their way down Africa's western coastline throughout the 1400s, developing increasingly sophisticated navigational techniques and ship designs capable of handling longer, more challenging ocean voyages than previous vessels had managed. This Portuguese exploration was driven partly by genuine curiosity, but primarily by practical economic motivation, finding a sea route to Asia's valuable spice trade that would bypass the overland routes and Venetian-controlled Mediterranean trade networks that had long dominated this lucrative commerce. Spain, watching Portugal's gradual progress with considerable interest, eventually funded its own ambitious exploratory venture, an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus proposing in 1492 that sailing directly westward across the Atlantic might reach Asia more quickly than Portugal's painstaking African coastal route. Columbus's calculations regarding the Earth's size proved significantly mistaken. though this error led to an outcome perhaps more historically significant than his original intended destination. Rather than reaching Asia, his expedition instead encountered islands in what Europeans would soon recognize as an entirely separate, previously unknown continental landmass. News of these encountered lands spread rapidly throughout Europe, again thanks significantly to printing technology, generating enormous excitement, ambition, and, for the indigenous peoples already living in these lands for thousands of years, the beginning of devastating, often violent colonial disruption that would unfold across subsequent centuries. Spanish and Portuguese exploration accelerated dramatically following Columbus's voyages, competing expeditions mapping increasingly extensive stretches of what Europeans began calling the New World, while simultaneously, Portuguese sailors finally succeeded in reaching Asia directly by sea, rounding Africa's southern tip. This age of exploration relied heavily upon Renaissance advances in mathematics, astronomy, and cartography, navigators using increasingly sophisticated instruments and star charts, developed through the same careful observational approach, driving broader Renaissance scientific curiosity. Mapmakers throughout Europe worked to incorporate this rapidly expanding geographic knowledge, printed maps becoming increasingly detailed and accurate as new information arrived from returning expeditions, gradually replacing older, less precise medieval geographic understanding with increasingly reliable representations of the actual physical world. Wealth flowing back into Europe from these new territories, particularly precious metals extracted from Spanish colonial holdings, significantly reshaped European economics, contributing to inflation and shifting economic power gradually away from previously dominant Mediterranean trading cities like Venice, toward Atlantic-facing nations better positioned for this new global trade. This age of exploration also brought European scholars into direct contact with plants, animals, and cultural practices entirely unfamiliar to classical or medieval European knowledge, challenging existing scientific and geographic assumptions inherited from ancient authorities who had, understandably, known nothing about these distant lands. By the mid-1500s, European understanding of the world's actual physical geography had expanded more dramatically within a single century than it arguably had during the entire preceding millennium, another remarkable, if ethically complicated, testament to the Renaissance era's broader spirit of ambitious inquiry, careful observation, and confident human capability, extending far beyond Europe's own familiar borders. Chapter 11: The English Renaissance and the Age of Shakespeare. While Italy's Renaissance had reached its most spectacular heights roughly a century earlier, England experienced its own distinctive cultural flowering somewhat later, particularly flourishing during the long reign of Queen Elizabeth I, beginning in 1558 and stretching across more than 4 remarkable decades. England had absorbed Renaissance humanist ideas gradually throughout the 1500s, English scholars traveling to Italy for education, returning home with classical learning and artistic sensibilities that slowly reshaped English intellectual and cultural life, even as the country navigated its own complicated religious transformation following its break from Catholic authority. Elizabeth herself, remarkably well educated for a monarch of any era, spoke multiple languages fluently and demonstrated genuine personal interest in literature, music, and scholarly pursuits, creating a royal court environment that actively encouraged cultural achievement alongside political stability during her notably long, largely peaceful reign. This stable, culturally engaged environment allowed English literature and theater to flourish remarkably during these decades, playwrights and poets producing work that many later scholars would consider comparable in significance to anything Renaissance Italy had achieved in painting or sculpture. Among these emerging talents, a playwright and poet from the market town of Stratford-upon-Avon would eventually achieve a level of lasting influence that few contemporaries could have fully anticipated. William Shakespeare's plays combined remarkable psychological insight, poetic language, and dramatic structure in ways that continue captivating audiences centuries after their original performances. London's theatre scene flourished considerably during this period, purpose-built playhouses drawing audiences across social classes, from wealthy nobility occupying private boxes to working-class Londoners standing in open-air pits, creating a genuinely broad, socially diverse audience for dramatic entertainment, unlike anything most previous eras had managed to sustain. This theatrical flourishing drew heavily upon Renaissance humanist education, playwrights incorporating classical historical subjects, mythological references, and rhetorical techniques learned through grammar school curricula, increasingly influenced by the same humanist educational values spreading throughout broader European intellectual life. English poetry similarly flourished during this period, writers experimenting with classical poetic forms adapted into English language and rhythm, creating distinctly English literary traditions that drew inspiration from Italian and classical models while developing genuinely original characteristics suited to English language and cultural sensibility. Printing technology, once again, proved crucial to this English literary flourishing, allowing plays, poetry, and prose to reach readers far beyond those able to attend live theatrical performances, gradually building the substantial body of published English literature that later centuries would consider foundational to the broader English literary tradition. Elizabeth's court also patronized music extensively, English composers developing increasingly sophisticated compositions that similarly reflected broader Renaissance musical innovations spreading throughout Europe during this same general period, blending careful technical craftsmanship with genuine emotional expressiveness. This English cultural flourishing occurred somewhat later than Italy's earliest Renaissance achievements, demonstrating how these broader cultural transformations spread gradually and unevenly across different regions of Europe, each absorbing and adapting Renaissance ideas according to their own particular political circumstances, religious situation, and existing cultural traditions. By the early 1600s, England had firmly established its own substantial contribution to the broader European Renaissance, one that, through Shakespeare's particularly enduring influence, would eventually reach and influence readers and audiences across the entire world for centuries following this remarkable, culturally rich period in English history. Chapter 12. Music and Architecture of the Renaissance. Alongside the celebrated achievements of painting, sculpture, and literature, Renaissance Europe also experienced significant transformation in musical composition and architectural design, developments perhaps less immediately visible to later generations, but equally significant to the era's broader cultural achievement. Medieval music had generally emphasized relatively simple vocal harmony, primarily serving religious liturgical purposes within church settings. Renaissance composers gradually developed increasingly complex polyphonic techniques, weaving multiple independent melodic lines together into rich, carefully structured harmonic compositions. Composers working in Northern Europe, particularly in Flanders and neighboring regions, became especially renowned for this increasingly sophisticated polyphonic style, their techniques and compositions spreading throughout Europe as musicians traveled between courts and cathedrals, carrying these innovations to new audiences and training new generations of composers. Josquin des Prez, working through the late 1400s and early 1500s, became one of this period's most celebrated composers, his compositions demonstrating remarkable technical sophistication alongside genuine emotional expressiveness that later scholars would consider comparable to the finest visual art the same era produced. Renaissance musical innovation also extended into secular composition, madrigals becoming increasingly popular throughout the 1500s, these vocal compositions setting poetry to intricate musical arrangements, often performed in intimate social settings among educated, wealthy audiences, rather than exclusively within religious contexts. Instrumental music similarly developed considerably during this period, instrument makers producing increasingly sophisticated designs, while composers began writing music specifically intended for instrumental performance rather than exclusively accompanying vocal composition, laying groundwork for instrumental music's continued development in following centuries. Architecture, meanwhile, underwent its own significant Renaissance transformation, architects moving decisively away from medieval Gothic style's soaring verticality and elaborate ornamentation toward classical Roman-inspired principles emphasizing careful mathematical proportion, symmetry, and restrained, harmonious decoration. Filippo Brunelleschi's earlier architectural innovations in Florence had established important foundational principles that subsequent architects continued developing and refining throughout the following century. Careful study of ancient Roman ruins, informing increasingly sophisticated understanding of classical architectural principles. Andrea Palladio, working primarily in the Venetian region during the mid-1500s, became particularly influential in codifying and popularizing these classical architectural principles. His published architectural treatises, spreading detailed guidance for proportion and design that influenced builders throughout Europe for centuries following his own lifetime. Renaissance architectural principles extended beyond individual buildings into broader urban planning considerations as well. City planners increasingly considering how public spaces, streets, and building facades might work together harmoniously, rather than developing purely organically, without coordinated aesthetic consideration. Private residential architecture also transformed significantly during this period, wealthy families commissioning increasingly elaborate palazzo designs that balanced practical living requirements with the same careful proportional principles and classical decorative elements defining the era's broader architectural achievement. By the close of the Renaissance period, European architecture and music had both undergone transformations every bit as significant as the more commonly celebrated achievements in painting and sculpture, contributing lasting principles and techniques that would continue shaping European artistic tradition for many generations following this remarkably productive cultural era. Chapter 13: War and Crisis in Renaissance Italy. Even as Italian cities produced some of history's most celebrated art, architecture, and scholarship, the peninsula itself remained politically fragmented and increasingly vulnerable, divided among competing city-states, papal territories, and various foreign claims that would eventually plunge the region into decades of devastating conflict. Beginning in 1494, French forces invaded Italy, initially pursuing a dynastic claim to the Kingdom of Naples, but ultimately triggering a much broader, more prolonged series of conflicts as Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and various Italian states all became entangled in shifting, complicated military and political alliances. These conflicts, later known collectively as the Italian Wars, would continue intermittently for decades, foreign armies repeatedly marching across Italian territory, cities changing hands between competing powers, and the peninsula's individual city-states finding themselves increasingly unable to maintain the independent political power that had earlier fueled their remarkable cultural achievements. Florence itself experienced significant political upheaval during this turbulent period, the Medici family briefly losing control of the city entirely before eventually returning to power. The city's political stability considerably more precarious than during the earlier decades of confident cultural patronage under Cosimo and his immediate successors. Rome suffered perhaps the most dramatic single catastrophe of this turbulent period in 1527, when unpaid, mutinous imperial troops brutally sacked the city, looting churches and palaces, killing thousands of residents, and effectively ending, at least temporarily, the extraordinary papal patronage that had funded so much remarkable high Renaissance artistic achievement. This sack of Rome sent shockwaves throughout the broader Renaissance cultural world, many considering it a symbolic ending point for the confident, optimistic high Renaissance spirit that had characterized earlier decades, replaced increasingly by a more anxious, uncertain cultural mood, reflecting the era's genuine political instability. Artists working during this later, more turbulent period increasingly developed a stylistic approach later historians would call mannerism, characterized by elongated figures, unusual perspective, and emotionally intense, sometimes deliberately unsettling compositions that seem to reflect this broader atmosphere of political anxiety and cultural uncertainty. Political theorists, meanwhile, grappled directly with these turbulent circumstances, Machiavelli's earlier pragmatic political writings gaining renewed relevance as Italian rulers desperately sought effective strategies for survival amid this prolonged period of foreign invasion, shifting alliances, and internal political instability. Venice managed to maintain somewhat greater independence and stability throughout much of this turbulent period compared to other Italian states, its unique geographic position and continued naval strength providing some protection from the worst disruptions affecting mainland Italian territories. Spain gradually emerged as the dominant foreign power controlling significant Italian territory by the time these prolonged conflicts finally concluded in 1559, effectively ending Italy's political independence for generations, even as the peninsula's cultural achievements continued influencing broader European artistic and intellectual development. This prolonged period of warfare and political instability significantly disrupted, though did not entirely end, Italy's continued artistic and cultural production, patronage patterns shifting as wealthy families and religious institutions adapted to considerably more precarious, uncertain political circumstances than earlier Renaissance decades had generally experienced. By the mid-1500s, the confident optimism characterizing the Renaissance's earlier decades had given way to a considerably more complicated, anxious cultural mood, Italy's political fragmentation and foreign domination standing in stark, sobering contrast to the remarkable artistic and intellectual achievements the same divided, vulnerable peninsula had somehow managed to produce. Chapter 14. The Late Renaissance and Mannerism. As the confident balance and harmonious proportion defining the High Renaissance's greatest achievements gradually gave way to the more turbulent political circumstances of the mid-1500s, artists throughout Italy began developing a distinctly different stylistic approach that would come to define the era's later decades. This style, which later art historians would name mannerism, took its name from the Italian word maniera, meaning style or manner, reflecting how these artists deliberately emphasize stylistic virtuosity and technical display, sometimes prioritizing dramatic visual effect over the naturalistic harmony earlier Renaissance masters had so carefully pursued. Mannerist painters often elongated human figures beyond natural anatomical proportion, twisted bodies into elaborate, sometimes physically improbable poses, and employed unusual, occasionally disorienting perspective and spatial composition that deliberately departed from the balanced, harmonious compositional principles Raphael and other earlier masters had established. Parmigianino, working through the 1520s and 1530s, became particularly associated with this emerging mannerist sensibility. His elegant, deliberately elongated figures and sophisticated technical virtuosity, representing a self-conscious artistic response to the seemingly unsurpassable achievements of the immediately preceding generation. This stylistic shift reflected broader cultural anxieties beyond purely artistic considerations. Many younger artists grappling with genuine uncertainty about how to meaningfully advance beyond Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael's seemingly definitive artistic achievements, leading toward increasingly stylized, self-consciously virtuosic alternative approaches. Michelangelo himself, living considerably longer than many contemporaries, continued working throughout much of this transitional period, his later works increasingly displaying characteristics that would influence emerging mannerist tendencies, particularly his later sculptural and architectural projects, showing greater emotional intensity and dramatic tension than his earlier, more classically balanced compositions. Sculpture similarly embraced this mannerist sensibility, artists like Benvenuto Cellini producing elaborate, technically dazzling works that emphasize dramatic movement and intricate detail, sometimes prioritizing spectacular visual effect over the more restrained classical balance earlier Renaissance sculptors had generally favored. This later Renaissance period also saw growing interest in elaborate, sometimes deliberately unsettling subject matter, artists exploring psychological tension, dramatic emotional intensity, and occasionally unusual, even bizarre imagery that reflected the broader period's more anxious, complicated cultural atmosphere compared to earlier decades' confident optimism. Architecture during this period similarly began incorporating more dramatic, sometimes deliberately unconventional elements, architects experimenting with unusual proportions and unexpected decorative details that departed from the strict classical harmony earlier Renaissance architects like Brunelleschi had so carefully established. Despite these stylistic departures from earlier Renaissance principles, Mannerist artists remained deeply connected to the broader Renaissance intellectual tradition, their technical training and classical knowledge firmly rooted in the same humanist educational foundations that had shaped the entire preceding century's artistic development. This Mannerist period gradually gave way, by the century's final decades, toward yet another significant stylistic transformation that later art historians would call the Baroque, an even more dramatically emotional, theatrical artistic approach that would dominate European art throughout much of the following century. By examining this later Mannerist period carefully, historians gained valuable insight into how artistic movements naturally evolve and transform across generations, each new cohort of artists inevitably grappling with, responding to, and eventually moving beyond the seemingly definitive achievements their most celebrated predecessors had established. Chapter 15: The End of the Renaissance and the Dawn of a New Era. By the final decades of the 1500s, the remarkable cultural period historians would eventually call the Renaissance was gradually giving way to new political, religious, and intellectual circumstances that would define an entirely different chapter of European history, even as many of the era's foundational achievements continued shaping European culture for centuries beyond its own eventual conclusion. Italy's political fragmentation and foreign domination, solidified through the prolonged Italian wars, meant the peninsula's individual city-states no longer possessed the independent wealth and political stability that had earlier fueled such extraordinary artistic and intellectual patronage during the Renaissance's most productive decades. The Catholic Church's own response to Protestant Reformation, a movement historians call the Counter-Reformation, redirected artistic patronage increasingly toward explicitly religious purposes, favoring dramatic, emotionally persuasive imagery designed to reinforce traditional faith rather than the more secular, classically inspired subjects earlier Renaissance patrons had often favored. Scientific inquiry, meanwhile, continued advancing well beyond the Renaissance's own chronological boundaries. Astronomers and physicists building directly upon Copernicus and Vesalius's earlier foundational work, developing increasingly sophisticated observational tools and mathematical methods that would eventually crystallize into what later centuries would recognize as the modern scientific method. Galileo Galilei, working primarily in the early 1600s, represents perhaps this transitional period's most significant figure. His telescopic astronomical observations, providing compelling direct evidence supporting Copernicus's earlier heliocentric theory, even as this scientific advocacy eventually brought him into serious conflict with church authorities increasingly anxious about challenges to traditional religious teaching. This gradual scientific advancement, continuing well beyond the Renaissance's traditional chronological boundaries, would eventually contribute to what historians call the scientific revolution, a period building directly upon Renaissance intellectual foundations while developing increasingly systematic, mathematically rigorous approaches to understanding natural phenomena. Northern European nations, particularly England, France, and the increasingly powerful Dutch Republic, gradually assumed greater cultural, economic, and political prominence during this transitional period. Their growing Atlantic trade connections and relative political stability providing advantages that Italy's fragmented, war-torn city-states could no longer easily match. The printing press's continued influence meant Renaissance humanist scholarship, classical texts, and accumulated artistic and scientific knowledge remained widely accessible, even as the specific historical circumstances that had originally produced this remarkable cultural flourishing gradually receded into a different, evolving historical period. Artistic styles continued evolving as well, the dramatic emotional intensity of the Baroque period gradually replacing Renaissance classical restraint throughout much of Catholic Europe, while different national artistic traditions increasingly developed their own distinctive characteristics, reflecting each region's particular political and religious circumstances. Historians studying this period retrospectively generally consider the Renaissance's core chronological boundaries as stretching roughly from the early 1300s through the late 1500s or early 1600s, though naturally, historical transitions rarely occur with clean, definitive boundaries, cultural change instead unfolding gradually, unevenly, and differently across various regions and different fields of human endeavor. By any reasonable historical measure, this extraordinary period had fundamentally transformed European art, architecture, literature, scientific inquiry, and broader intellectual culture, establishing foundational achievements and ways of thinking that would continue influencing Western civilization for centuries, following the Renaissance's own gradual, complicated conclusion. Chapter 16: The Legacy of the Renaissance, Closing Chapter. Centuries after Florence's earliest artistic stirrings first began transforming European culture, the Renaissance's remarkable legacy continues shaping how we understand art, science, education, and human potential itself. Its influence woven so thoroughly into modern civilization that we often forget just how genuinely revolutionary these developments once were. The very idea that individuals could pursue excellence across multiple fields simultaneously, that careful observation and reasoned inquiry could meaningfully advance human understanding, and that classical learning held genuine value worth actively rediscovering, all trace directly back to this remarkable period's foundational intellectual achievements. Modern museums throughout the world still draw millions of visitors annually, specifically to view Renaissance masterworks, Michelangelo's sculptures, Leonardo's paintings, and countless other achievements from this era, continuing to captivate audiences centuries after their original creation, their technical mastery and emotional depth remaining genuinely moving even to viewers separated by hundreds of years and vastly different cultural circumstances. The printing press's revolutionary impact on knowledge distribution, established patterns of information sharing, and collaborative intellectual progress that, in modified form, continue underlying how human knowledge accumulates and spreads, even today. Our own era's digital information revolution, representing merely the latest chapter in this much longer, ongoing story. Renaissance humanism's emphasis on broad, well-rounded education, valuing literature, history, and philosophy alongside more narrowly practical skills, continues influencing educational philosophy throughout much of the world, even as each generation debates and reconsiders exactly how this humanist educational ideal should best be implemented. The scientific curiosity awakened during this period, however tentative its earliest expressions may have seemed, eventually blossomed into the systematic scientific method that continues driving human understanding of the natural world forward. From medicine and astronomy to countless other fields Renaissance thinkers could barely have imagined. Architecture throughout much of the world still draws upon classical proportional principles that Renaissance architects like Brunelleschi and Palladio so carefully studied and codified, their careful mathematical approach to beauty and structural harmony continuing to inform building design many centuries after their own original architectural achievements. Perhaps most significantly, the Renaissance's core assumption that individual human beings possess genuine capacity for remarkable achievement, creativity, and understanding fundamentally shifted how subsequent generations understood human potential itself, an assumption so thoroughly embedded within modern thought that we rarely pause to consider its genuinely revolutionary historical origins. The tensions and complications this period also introduced, between traditional authority and individual inquiry, between religious faith and scientific observation, between different nations and cultures increasingly connected through global exploration and trade, continue shaping ongoing human conversations that remain genuinely unresolved, even in our own contemporary moment. Standing today before a Renaissance painting, reading Renaissance literature, or studying scientific principles first seriously questioned during this remarkable period, we remain connected, whether we consciously recognize it or not, to Florentine workshops, Venetian trading ships, German printing presses, and countless individual thinkers who collectively transformed how humanity understood itself and its place within the broader universe. As this long, winding story finally draws toward its quiet close, perhaps what remains most remarkable about the Renaissance isn't any single painting, building, or scientific discovery, but rather the broader spirit animating the entire period, a genuine, patient curiosity about human potential and the natural world, carried forward gently across centuries, resting now quietly within our own continuing, unfinished story. And so, as this long journey through Renaissance history settles gently toward its close, let these old stones, faded paintings, and patient centuries of careful human curiosity carry you now toward whatever peaceful rest awaits, the story itself continuing quietly onward, long after these particular words have finally, gently, faded into silence.